Most buyers don't get overwhelmed by the home. They get overwhelmed by the what ifs that they don't see coming. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Sam Enright, and sitting across from me is my co-host, Zach Dickson. And today, guys, we are back with another installment of our What If series, breaking down some hypothetical yet highly realistic scenarios for you guys and talking about how to navigate around those so you guys can get prepared, because ultimately this is buying homes. This is the mortgage business. This is real estate. And I know you guys don't work in it necessarily, but there are always, things that just come out of the blue for us, here and there. So it's always fun to kind of break those down, talk about them, maybe even interject some good laughs and, get you guys prepared for what ifs.
Absolutely. I always enjoy doing these because like you said, you really never know what's going to come on the docket here in the real estate sector, especially when we get into, the residential real estate side. It's a bag of tricks sometimes. You never really know. So having to or getting through some of these scenarios, some of the things that we've seen, some of the things again hypothetical, but very well could happen. We've talked a lot this year about preparation, having these things laid out in front of you, talking about it, and kind of how to navigate them is a great tool in the toolbox, no doubt. So, yep, super excited for today's episode for sure.
Love it, man. Yeah. So, guys, just kind of giving a general overview here of episode, which is to one, allow you guys to understand that a lot of these situations are actually more normal than you guys think. So, some of these what ifs, yes, have been a little bit maybe considered out there. A lot of them are a little bit more common. And so we have a mixed bag of that today, just talking about some things that you will normally see. And then also, some things that you're like, there's just no way that comes up, but, you would be surprised. It definitely does. So again, preface all of that with saying, a lot of these things that we talk about, if not all of them, does not necessarily mean that your real estate transaction is dead, that there is no way to navigate around it, that there is, if these things pop up, that you're just kind of up a creek without a paddle, right? So there are ways to get around these things, but they can throw, some bumps in the road and make it a little bit more of a challenging journey, but that doesn't mean that we can't get through it. So, and that brings me to my last point, is that obviously preparation is key. We've talked about this a lot this year. I feel like we've almost beat the drum so much about how preparation is important, but it ultimately really is. I know at this point it can be kind of probably taken lightly because we've said it so many times, but the reality is that being ready, prepared for these things is highly important. And so obviously when you're working with professionals, when you're working with people inside of the industry that have years of experience, a lot of this stuff is not going to be, while it may be new for you, it's not necessarily going to be new for them, right? And so, having that confidence on that back end to be working with that professional that, can help guide you through these things is highly, highly important. So that said, guys, let's jump into our first what if. So, Zach, this one is going to pertain to you and the real estate side of it specifically. So, let's dive in and tell the people about what if you encounter multiple offers on a home that you are interested in.
For sure. Spoiler alert, you may have a further dive into this coming soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that here in the next couple of weeks. But for this scenario and for this episode here in the what if, having multiple offers on the same home that you are interested in offering on, this can absolutely feel discouraging for a buyer, especially after they walk through the property and they decide that this is the one we are ready to offer. Let's go write it up. And then the information may come in that the seller already has multiple offers in hand. And now we have to compete with that. And so I think generally speaking, people, competition can scare people a little bit, having a little bit of something to measure yourself against or something like that. And so while this can feel a little bit intimidating and even discouraging as a buyer, it absolutely is not personal. Obviously people are operating in their own lane. Obviously if you enjoyed the property that you just toured, you're ready to make an offer on the property. That doesn't mean in turn that other people are not, solely because you are. Ultimately what we have to do is be focused on ourselves and how we can structure the offer, how we can structure our situation to be the most advantageous for you yourself, the individual. Ultimately when we start getting too caught up in other people, what other people are doing, their processes, those types of things, that's going to bog you down and distract you from the individualized plan that you need to put yourself into. And how we do that is preparation and feeling confident. You got to put the prep work in. You have to make sure that you are confident in what you are doing in the offer that you are presenting, and that is going to give you the best chance to have success in a multi-offer situation. Again, we have to focus on what we can control, and what we can control is the prep work, is the communication with our team, is the things within our grasp. And unfortunately, one thing that we cannot control is what other people are doing and how they are going about their business. So, spending time spending time thinking about what other people are doing, spending time thinking about what their offer is going to be, how we can beat it, ultimately is not going to be the best plan for success. The time spent thinking about ourselves, putting together an individualized plan, is how we will succeed in a multi-offer situation. Now, this is absolutely one of those what ifs that is very, very practical. As we've talked about, over the last 12 months or so in our content, we are in very much a tight market and competitive market, and multi-offer situations are very prevalent even still to this day. And so this is a good what if situation all in all, because again, it's something that if you are a home buyer ready to get started on your journey, it is likely going to be something that you endure throughout the process. Again, when we're focusing on ourselves, when we make sure that we're thinking about ourselves, we have to realize that in a multi-offer situation, it does not mean that you did something wrong. Ultimately, it means that the seller did something right. They have a property that is in high demand. They've upkept it well. They're in a good location. That is not something that you did wrong. And so we just kind of have to reframe that perspective a little bit and take a step back and again focus on ourselves and the plan that we want to set forth as an individual.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I know that, we have clients who deal with this a lot, especially today's world, the market that we're in, again, nothing that, necessarily is wrong on your part, right? It just means, you might have similar tastes and you might have, things that check your box that check a lot of other people's boxes as well. And so, competition is not always a bad thing, right? So, um, being prepared, putting yourself in the best situation to capitalize on those opportunities is ultimately the most important thing. And you can't hang your hat if your offer is not accepted, and kind of move on to the next one and go from there. So try not to get too discouraged by it.
So with that being said, great first what if scenario there. Why don't you take us into our second what if scenario, Sam? This is right up your alley as our uh, in-house lender here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking at our next what if your monthly payment comes in higher than originally expected, right? So, this is kind of one that's can be a little tough for some folks ultimately, right? Because when we set out on a pre-approval, we have a specific dollar amount in mind. Most typically, most clients have an idea of a budget. It's not normally open-ended, and you're usually looking to keep your payment around a certain point, right? So what if it comes in higher than expected? Well, I guess we first need to dissect what that means and how that can potentially happen, right? So one of the main things that will normally increase a payment from a pre-approval to when you actually go into contract is going to be your interest rate, right? So if you started shopping, let's say a month, 2 months ago, and you were pre-approved and rates have started to move, the market has started to fluctuate and rates have gone up since then. You could be, it's not normally going to be massive differences, but, you could be looking at an eighth, a quarter, 3/8 of a difference in an interest rate, just depending on how long, it's been since, you were originally quoted that number and what's gone on in the market since then, right? So, what, new reports have come out, how the bond market has reacted to that, all play massive roles in where interest rates are at. So that's one of the big things that, can happen. Ultimately, this whole section really, in my opinion, boils down to communication from the lender and having these open-ended conversations from the beginning, right? So if you do go in a contract, you do get a home, having that conversation. Hey, just want to let you know, rates have definitely fluctuated since you originally, were shopping. We're looking at about 1/4% higher. That's going to impact the payment, right? Other reasons for that are going to be, when we set out on a pre-approval, we're going to always estimate taxes. We're always going to estimate homeowners insurance. Taxes is really tough because ultimately every home located in different areas is going to have a different tax amount, right? So we try to be as aggressive as we can be without being over the top, like, $100, $200 more a month in taxes, getting you prepped for the wrong thing. But, there have been instances in where, maybe we have undershot it a little bit and taxes do come in a little bit higher depending on the area that you end up purchasing in. Maybe you were looking in a specific area at one point and that, search kind of changed and became widespread. And now you're in a different area that maybe has a little bit more expensive of taxes. So, that is something that, maybe you had a certain expectation in your head and that has not now been met because, we've changed those things. So again, comes down to communication on the lender's part, on your part, to have those open-ended conversations just about, hey, where things were at, what we originally talked about versus where we are at now. Another thing is homeowners insurance. This is a tricky one because ultimately inside of the loan application, once you do engage in a purchase contract, you have the ability to shop for your own homeowners insurance. And so, we have had clients in the past who have chosen to go with specific insurance companies that they've had relationships with for a long period of time. And maybe those rates are not always as competitive as what else is out there on the market. We have had clients. I mean, I remember a specific situation where a client had been with State Farm for like 9, 10 years. Very, very adamant. I am not leaving State Farm. I am not switching insurance. And their insurance payment was higher than what we had originally, projected that out. I had that conversation with them, let them know, hey, we were, originally at about $140 a month. Your policy right now is at about 170. They're like, all good with me. I'm not switching. I have no interest in doing that. Let's just, move forward with the insurance that we have. So there are variables when it comes to your monthly payment that things can change as you move on and progress through the transaction. And again, we do the best that we can with the information we have in that pre-approval stage. So I'm always going to be proactive when it comes to estimating a higher number, because I tell a lot of our clients is I would rather tell you that the payment's going to be $100 more a month and then you go in a contract and it's $100 less than be on the other side of that where it's $150 more. So I would say this is a little bit less common ultimately, for most clients to see their payment jump up by a bunch. Now, if we're talking, ones and twosies, here and there, $5, $10, yes, that stuff can change very, very little here and there, but massive differences are not normally something that we experience a whole lot, but they can happen. And it's really just about going in, having those conversations and making sure that the professionals that you're working with set that proper expectation with you. So, and another thing that can kind of help safeguard this is when you are going out and you're looking at multiple properties. Once you do have a deciding, house that you want to go in on, there's tons of mortgage calculators out there. Obviously, your lender professional can be of assistance in this as well, as to helping you run payments for that home specifically, because once you have a house in mind, you can actually pull tax data off the county websites and get that number squared in, dialed in there. And then the only variable that would necessarily be left over at that point would really just be, your homeowner's insurance. The rate, if you're asking them, they should be able to quote you as of that day's rate. So, you're not going to see too many differences at that point. So, really just more so about having those open-ended conversations, making sure that you're being upfront and honest. And obviously that onus is on us as well to be upfront and honest about where the payment's at, and where things are, based on the home that you based on the home that you're putting an offer in on. So obviously we try not to, you want to steer clear of making assumptions on things, and make sure that that data is up to date when you are going out and looking at homes, especially if it's been a couple of months since you originally got pre-approved.
Yeah, great points there for sure, Sam. I mean, honestly, it like you mentioned, it's going to fluctuate a little bit here and there, but open lines of communication is huge, and at that point, it's not going to change dramatically if you do have those open lines of communication and are talking to your professionals about what is going on in the search. We'll be able to get those pretty dialed in, like you mentioned, for sure. So.
Yeah, ultimately, man, it's all about just having those conversations instead of panicking, talking with your lender, seeing what options you have, especially when it comes to things that are controllable. Property taxes, not necessarily something you're going to be able to control on that side of things, but, insurance, getting multiple quotes from different sources, talking about interest rate options if you have gotten to a place where the payment maybe is a little bit above what you were expecting, and seeing what can be done to kind of get that a little bit lower for you, or maybe floating rates if the market's indicating that there's going to be a little bit of a drop coming up. These are all things that can be had, conversations that can be had, to kind of safeguard against these payments going up. So try not to panic. Try to just make sure you go in with an open mind and trust and work with your real estate professionals in order to get yourself in the best position.
Absolutely. Speaking of the real estate professionals, that really takes me into our next scenario of our what if episode today, and that is what if the timeline takes longer than expected. Now, this is a scenario that absolutely does come up very, often. I would say often. There are going to be scenarios in which we do not meet the written in closing date to the contract, and these are absolutely normal. This could be anything from financing to stuff with title, stuff on the seller's side. Really, anything like this could push our timeline to closing back just a little bit. And really that goes to, a couple of different things. As we've spoken about previously in different episodes, there is a whole lot of back end work going on throughout the professional team while the contract is taking place, from acceptance to closing date. You have a lot of stuff going in on the back end that you as the buyer are absolutely participating in, and number two, not participating in as a whole at all. And so there are things that can absolutely come up in these scenarios that can delay the timeline. If there's stuff on the title work that needs to be taken care of by the seller, that is going to maybe delay the timeline. If there's stuff that is going on with your financing where you need to provide extra documentation on different things, that may delay the timeline as well. Ultimately, these things are normal. But I think that the next part of the scenario is when the open lines of communication are not there between the buyer and the seller. If these things are taking place, there needs to be open lines of communication between both the buyer and the seller through their agents to make sure that everybody is still on the same page throughout the duration of the contract. Generally speaking, sellers are going to be okay with extending the contract for reasons out, whatever the reason may be, as long as that is communicated to them in a timely fashion. The issue starts to build when these things are going on the back end, and maybe you as the buyer know, the buyer's agent knows, and they are not communicating these things to the seller. And ultimately, maybe 3 days, 5 days before closing, we get there and we're like, we're not going to be able to get closed, we need to extend. That is usually not going to be received in the best manner possible when we've known about this for whatever, however long it may be, a week, 2 weeks, whatever. And so I think that is when, stress starts to build in those scenarios, when those the communication lines are not open between all parties. Expectations can then be set at that point when communication is made. And, obviously without expectations, that is another scenario in which stress can build and will build for all involved, honestly, whether it's your agent, the buyer, the seller, the seller's agent, the lenders, the title company, all of those people. It's the stress is going to compound on all of those people when open lines of communications are not had.
Yeah, touching base on the lender side of things when it comes to the timeline taking longer, right? This is something that is more normal than you think that it is. Obviously, there's so many things in place to try and safeguard against this and make sure that contracts are done before the timeline and the contract date. However, there are contracts that run over. This could be, like Zach mentioned, for a plethora of different reasons. And ultimately, from my experience in the business, being open and honest with everybody involved is going to be the biggest thing, right? Because we always tell buyers this, at least, because I know sometimes the thought process is, well, hey, what if the seller doesn't want to extend? And I always tell them, you got to think about this from a different perspective, right? Ultimately, if a seller decides to not continue with the contract that is already in place, let's say we've gotten to day 25, you have a 30-day contract and we're asking for a 3-day extension. At that point, you have a contract that is set for 30 days. Until that contract expires, we're still in contract. Afterwards, if they decide not to extend, they would have to put the house back on the market. They would have to start doing showings again. They'd have to start doing these open houses, getting the home, getting more interest in it, getting another offer in. So let's just say at best that takes a week, if not a little bit longer, right? To get somebody else back in the home, back interested in it. And then you have a whole nother 30-day process to restart with the lending side of it, unless by some act of miracle, somebody comes along with like some sort of cash offer or something, to speed that timeline up, right? So it's one of those things where it's always, in my opinion, going to make more sense for a seller to continue on to the contract that has already been put in place if we have confidence that, hey, this is just, we need a couple of additional days, not, hey, this is not going to happen, right? And so having those open lines of communication, having that conversation, just letting everybody know it's a little bit of clerical stuff. We just need a little bit more additional documentation. It's not that the loan's not going to close. We just need a little bit more additional time, right? And so once you start setting that conversation, setting those expectations, it usually puts everybody else at ease, and something that can be worked through. So try not to stress too much. Again, obviously, the goal is to always try to be done early, rather than even on the contract date. But again, that's the whole premise of this episode, right? What ifs, because ultimately this is the real estate business and there are things that pop up that are out of anybody's control and we just have to work and navigate through them. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of all I have on the timeline. I just wanted to reiterate a couple of those things, on that side of it.
Love it, brother. Love it. Appreciate you with the insight on that side of the equation for sure. Why don't you get us into our final what if scenario of the episode here?
Yeah. So final one that we wanted to talk about was, what if your credit score changes or your credit changes during the loan process? A lot of things here, right? Some things to definitely be mindful of. Why does this normally happen, or how does this happen? Better worded. Ultimately, when you pull a credit report, normally the date that you pull it is going to be the previous month's data. So if I were to pull a credit report this month, most of the accounts are going to be either updated at the beginning of February, or they would be, at the tail end or middle of January, right? So we're usually getting data that's already about a month old. And so if anything has happened, anything's changed, you put any large purchases on credit cards, anything like that, and that does not report for the next credit cycle or the credit cycle after that, that is normally where you're going to start to see some fluctuations, right? Is the scores can change based on any sort of variables that have changed in that interim time period. So some safeguards against that, some things that we would recommend on that side of things. One, I'm sure you guys have heard it. I'm sure we've talked about it, but if you were to ever Google or ask anybody if there's things that you should avoid credit wise while you're in the middle of a home loan transaction or pre-approval process. A is to avoid opening new credit cards, new trade lines. You don't want to just, if you don't have a car loan and you go out and get a car loan in the middle of your pre-approval, that's going to change not only your credit, but it's going to change your debt to income ratio, because now you have an additional debt on your credit each month, right? So avoid big purchases. You're going to, obviously, I think this goes without saying, but you're going to want to avoid making any late payments, having any changes to your derogatory history on that side of things. If it make your payments on time. Sorry, that's I feel like that kind of goes without saying, but that is one that we do see a little bit of. And then ultimately, large purchases on credit cards. So open new trade lines, on time payments, and then spending on accounts that are already open, because ultimately if you have a $3,000 balance on a credit card and that jumps to $7,000 balance, that's also going to, one, change your utilization, and then two, it's going to change your monthly minimum payment. So both of those factors are working against you in that regard. Now, when it comes to the credit score and if it changes, normally we will have these conversations with our clients. I actually just had a conversation with a client yesterday who I had sent out for a pre-approval, and he was like, "Hey, I just want to clear a couple of things. Like, if there was anything that I needed to watch out for on this as I go through the pre-approval process, what would it be?" And I was just upfront and honest with him. I said, "Look, we pulled your credit. Your credit's good for 120 days from the date that we pull. So realistically, we do not need to re-pull your credit anytime in this time period. So you have about a 4-month window. You really would want to find a house probably about day 90. That way you can afford yourself the 30-day contract period without having to re-pull the credit." And so I just was like, everything we just talked about, make sure you're keeping your credit the same, make sure we're not opening new credit accounts, no late payments, anything like that, because on the off chance that you don't find a house in this time period and we have to re-pull credit, we need to be very mindful of where that is at and what can impact that, because we have seen it before where we've pulled credit and then 4 months later they haven't found a house, we re-pull credit and their credit score is worse, and maybe now they're not even in a position where their credit's high enough to even be pre-approved. So you went from having a pre-approval to having these things show up on credit to now you're no longer even pre-approved anymore, right? So definitely something that needs to be thought about and gone at from a methodical thought process on the buyer side. The good news is, inside of that, if you guys caught it, is that the credit, when it is pulled, is good for 120 days from the date of pull. So if you have your credit pulled and you go find a house on day 30, there's really not any reason that we should need to re-pull your credit inside of that home loan transaction. So at that point, you guys would be kind of in that safeguarded area. Now, that doesn't mean go and do the things that we talked about. Just because your credit's locked in doesn't mean go out and put a huge purchase or put some new trade line on there. But it is kind of a safeguard for you to know that, hey, my credit's here. It's already been pulled. I'm good for this amount of time. I don't have to necessarily worry about having my credit re-pulled. So, there will be people that will reach out to us and be like, "Hey, we think we've seen some fluctuations in our credit." And I will reassure them, "Hey, we already pulled your credit. So we're not going to have to necessarily re-pull it. So you guys should be fine." On that side of things. So ultimately, comes back to what we talked about: communication. If you are noticing these things, if something does pop up, like I remember had a client last year who was like, "Hey, my car totaled. I need to get a new car. I'm in the middle of this transaction. I'm pre-approved. I'm looking to buy a house. Should I go out and get a new car loan?" And I just basically told them, "Here's the options. You can go out and get a new car loan, but we're going to need to reevaluate your pre-approval at that time. If you have now taken on an even larger payment than what you already have, we need to rework the numbers, or you can not do that and go a different route." And so the client opted ultimately to end up going out, paying cash for the car, a car, instead of, going out and getting a new car loan and that sort of thing. So, but that conversation was vitally important, because when you talk with your lender, you guys can create a game plan together. It's not so much as telling you you cannot do this. It's more so, okay, hey, here's your options. Here's how we'll reevaluate it depending on which option and which route you decide to go down. That way you can go out and do what you need to do while also remaining secure in what it is that you've already built.
Absolutely. That's great information because I think that this might be the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Indirect what if situation that we see. People don't like grow, they don't negligently try to go out and do this. They do this indirectly. You know what I mean? It happens like without even trying. You don't even realize it. And it's something that they don't even know is kind of a thing, I would say, when they, get started on the in the pre-approval process, and then they go open a new credit card, don't even realize. And so I think that this is a good what if scenario, generally speaking, for the masses, honestly, because it should be public information to not do these things when you're getting started and it's such a large financial purchase. Obviously, like you mentioned, there are scenarios in which you can't control that do pop up, and that is where the open lines of communication really pop up, or really fit in for you as the buyer, to have that conversation with the lender and find a path forward of least resistance for sure. Well, guys, those are our 4 what if scenarios for today's iteration of the What If series. Again, some hypotheticals in there, some that we've definitely seen, and some that are very, very much prevalent for all buyers, and especially first time home buyers as a whole. Again, really just want to reflect and reassure that these situations do happen, some more often than the others, like I just mentioned. But again, you don't have to handle them alone. You, as the buyer, have a team of professionals around you for a reason. Use these people as resources, have open lines of communication with these people, and ultimately all of these situations are fixable or able to be navigated, and at the end of the day can be, rectified as a whole. So we want to make sure that we have clarity on the situation. We don't need to be perfect in any of these scenarios. We just have to have open lines of communication and talk with our professionals, and everything can be solved for sure.
Ultimately, you hit the nail on the head. These are, the whole point of these episodes is to show you, how common these things actually are, right? And that, these situations, while unfortunate in nature at times, right, are just part of said nature, right? So we have to learn how to deal with them. We have to learn how to navigate them. And, that is why ultimately you bring professionals in to do this. This is why you don't, you know, engage in a home loan on your own. This is why you don't, I mean, maybe some of you do, but this is why you don't negotiate your contracts on your own. You bring in real estate professionals and you have people that are able to help you do these things, because ultimately, these things do happen. There are very, very few just smooth sailing loan transactions out there, just because of the nature of what getting a home loan actually is. I mean, I feel like I've talked about this on other episodes, but like the amount of like guidelines and different things that are in my brain when it comes to like navigating these things, it's crazy. So when they say they will ask for nothing short of your firstborn child, it's a hyperbole, but there's justifications behind it, right? Because obviously that is what it feels like. They're asking for everything under the sun. So and with that, there is things that do pop up, and situations that have to be navigated. So I love it, bro. Obviously, great reassurance for everybody that, these are just natural parts of things, and that they can be rectified, and that it's not a straight deal killer, and that you're not just going to lose your house that you want, because these things pop up. Right. So
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Well, just a reminder, guys, again, we do come out with a new episode every Friday at 12 p.m. Be sure to check us out on all platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, have the video form on YouTube as well. Feel free to share us with anybody that you feel would benefit from this knowledge and finding out about these what if scenarios ahead of time. Again, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you guys on the next episode.
all right, guys, we'll see you.